Hi, my name's Tim Bayne, and I'm Professor of Philosophy at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. This is the fourth in a series of lectures that I'm recording for the Moscow Centre for Consciousness Studies on our knowledge of the conscious lives of others, where the scope of this others includes human beings, non-human animals, and even AI systems. In the previous lecture, I examined attempts to identify consciousness in human beings who have suffered from severe brain damage and are behaviorally non-responsive. We saw in that lecture that significant progress has been made in identifying signs of covert consciousness in these patient groups. However, we also saw that these methods rely in fundamental ways on our ordinary pre-theoretical ways of ascribing consciousness, such as the use of the ability to follow commands or to follow a narrative. Thus, I suggested, these methods are unlikely to provide the tools for identifying consciousness in other kinds of contested or difficult cases, such as those that involve non-human animals or AI systems. There are really two reasons for this. The first is that in many cases, these measures can't really be applied. For example, we won't be able to rely on command following or narrative comprehension, the capacity to answer questions, yes/no questions, if we're interested in the possibility of consciousness in, say, human neonates or fish. The second reason is that even when these three pre-theoretical measures can be applied, we may not be confident that they reliably track the presence of consciousness in other kinds of systems. In fact, the further we go from home base, that is, adult, neurotypical human beings, the less confident we are, or perhaps should be, that these pre-theoretical measures track the presence or consciousness, the presence or absence of consciousness. So, although the tools of science, such as fMRI devices, EEG, and so on, might augment our ordinary methods for seeing into the inner world of experience in the way in which the development of the telescope augmented the ability of scientists to peer into the far reaches of the external world, for the most part, what we really need isn't more data about an entity's behavior or its internal states. Instead, what we need are better tools for understanding and interpreting that data with respect to questions of consciousness. In other words, what we need to know is how to draw inferences about consciousness from neural behavioral data. And that, many would argue, requires a theory of consciousness. Perhaps we don't need a theory of consciousness in order to know whether our friends and family members are conscious, but we do, so the thought runs, need a theory in order to know whether newborn babies, snails, robots are conscious. And without a theory, the thought runs, we won't really be able to make significant progress on what I've been calling the scientific problem of other minds. I think this demand for theory is certainly a tempting one, and it's hard to deny that having a comprehensive theory of consciousness would put us in a position to solve the scientific problem of other minds. What's less clear, however, is whether making progress on the scientific problem requires a comprehensive theory of consciousness. If it does, then it looks as though we might be caught in a kind of dilemma. On the one hand, we might think that we need a comprehensive theory of consciousness in order to make warranted or justified claims about consciousness in other types of systems. But in order to develop a comprehensive theory of consciousness, it looks as though we will need to know which systems are conscious and which aren't. In other words, the worry is that we might both need to rely on theory and yet be unable to rely on theory. And if this thought is right, then the skeptical problem of other minds, the scientific problem of other minds, would really be unsolvable. Let's call this the circularity challenge. Broadly speaking, I think we can see two main responses to the circularity challenge in the contemporary literature, in the current literature. Although these responses are usually implicit in what theorists say and are not all that often explicitly defended. The first of these two approaches is what I'm going to call a top-down approach. It attempts to derive a comprehensive theory of consciousness from first principles. This is also known as an axiomatic approach to consciousness. And I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about what that might look like. A second approach to this problem, the circularity challenge, involves what we might think of as a bottom-up approach. Here you begin with a theory of human consciousness and work outwards from that theory, assuming that what holds true of the human case, or more precisely what holds true of the adult neurotypical human case, perhaps, will also apply to other kinds of cases and can be generalized to, say, the neonate, to non-human animals, and perhaps even to AI systems. I'll call that the correlational approach. And what I'm going to suggest in this lecture is that neither of these two approaches, neither the axiomatic approach nor the correlational approach, is really all that tenable, although there is, I think, something to be learned from the problems facing both approaches. In the next lecture, just to look ahead, I'm going to develop and engage with another approach, which I think is more promising, the natural kind approach. Okay, so let's start with the axiomatic approach to the task of building a theory of consciousness. In principle, the axiomatic approach could be used to develop and defend any theory of consciousness, but in practice, the axiomatic approach is very much wedded to one particular theory, the integrated information theory developed by Giulio Tononi and his collaborators, for example, Christoph Koch, Melanie Bolli, and now Suchiya. According to the integrated information theory, or IIT as it's referred to, consciousness should be understood in terms of what's called cause-effect power, a phenomenon which reflects the amount of maximally irreducible integrated information that's generated by a physical system. And integrated information, according to IIT, is in turn associated with an information theoretic quantity called phi, which measures, broadly speaking, how much information is generated by a system as a whole compared to its parts considered independently. According to IIT, consciousness is an intrinsic fundamental property of a system, and it's determined both by the nature of the causal mechanisms that compose that system and by their state. My concern here is primarily not with what IIT says or even whether it's plausible, but with the general contours of the approach that the advocates of IIT take, and in particular, their appeal to an axiomatic way of justifying IIT. Now, as I understand it, the axiomatic approach involves a three-stage process. Stage one begins with identifying what they call axioms of consciousness. These concern essential phenomenal properties of experience. Stage two of the axiomatic approach involves inferring or deducing from these axioms what the advocates of IIT call postulates, which are computational features features of a system that are required in order for the axioms to hold. And stage three involves moving from postulates to an account of the fundamental nature of consciousness, which one can then use to identify which systems are conscious and which systems aren't. In the case of IIT, of course, moving through this process is meant to take one from to the information theoretic quantity that I referred to earlier, phi, and thus to provide one with a means of identifying which creatures are conscious and which ones aren't. One simply looks to the amount of phi that the system has. In fact, IIT is meant to deliver not just an account of which creatures are conscious and which aren't, but also what level of consciousness particular creatures have or particular systems are in, and what their particular conscious contents are. But I'm going to leave those details to one side here. Now, I'm also going to leave to one side the fact that phi itself is extremely difficult to measure in anything other than extremely simple systems. But leaving that important detail to one side, the attractions of this approach are, I think, undeniable. Rather than relying on our pre-theoretical markers of consciousness in order to tell whether a certain kind of system is conscious, if the axiomatic approach adopted by IIT is plausible, then we can simply address the question of the distribution of consciousness in a principled manner. But although it's certainly attractive, I'm going to argue that the allure of the axiomatic approach should be resisted. My comments are going to focus on the first stage of the axiomatic approach, the identification of axioms, because it's here, it seems to me, is where the action is. But before I look at that issue, the identification of axioms and their interpretation, I want to discuss a more general worry with the case for IIT that's been developed by the computer scientist Scott Aaronson. In a very influential blog post, Aaronson pointed out that if IIT is right, then all sorts of very simple systems, such as expander graphs, are conscious. Indeed, the problem's actually worse for this, for not only does IIT imply that many kinds of extremely simple systems are conscious, it also implies that certain versions of these systems would have an extremely high level of consciousness. potentially a level of consciousness higher than the level that we have. And the point here is that the implications of IIT for which entities are conscious and which aren't seems to be strongly, robustly at odds with common sense. And that, one might think, ought to be regarded as a serious mark against its plausibility. The test of a theory of consciousness, Aaronson claimed, and this is a quote, is whether it can produce results agreeing with common sense intuition. For example, whether it can affirm from first principles that most humans are conscious, that dogs and horses are also conscious, but less so, that rocks, livers, bacteria colonies, and existing digital computers are not conscious or are hardly conscious, and that a room full of people has no mega consciousness over and above the consciousness of the individuals. The reason it's so important that the theory uphold common sense on these test cases is that, given the experimental inaccessibility of consciousness, this is basically the only test available to us, and that's an end of the quote there. Now, there's a lot in that quote, there's a lot in this line of argument with which I'm very sympathetic. But there are also a few things that one might want to take issue with. For one thing, it's really not clear, it seems to me, how much weight our pre-theoretical intuitions about the distribution of consciousness should be given. Indeed, it's not even clear what those intuitions are. For example, Aaronson says that we have the intuition that dogs and horses are conscious, but less so than we are. Well, I'm not sure that I do have that intuition. Indeed, I'm not really sure that I know what it is for one organism to be less conscious than another. Perhaps more importantly, advocates of the axiomatic approach will argue that whatever our pre-theoretical intuitions are, we actually don't have much reason to put much faith in them. After all, they might say, the only intuitions about the distribution of consciousness that have a sure foundation are those that are theoretically grounded. And the kinds of intuitions to which Aaronson is appealing aren't theoretically grounded. Moreover, they might point out, the idea that we can have reason to reject intuitions that are both widely held and extremely plausible is a familiar one. Consider the claim that for every well-defined property, there's a set of all and only the objects that have that property. This principle is extremely attractive. It seems to be intuitively compelling, but of course, Bertrand Russell pointed out many, many decades ago that it leads to paradox. Let R be the set of all sets that are not members of themselves. If R is not a member of itself, then its definition entails that it is a member of itself. And if it is a member of itself, then it is not a member of itself, since it is the set of all sets that are not members of themselves. So we can have reason to reject extremely strongly held, very intuitively plausible principles. So where do these observations leave us? Here's where I think we're left once the dust on this debate has settled. In evaluating a theory of consciousness, we should take seriously the degree to which it accords with our central pre-theoretical intuitions, that is, intuitions which are both strong and widely held. To the extent that a theory accords with those intuitions, it's a mark in its favor, and to the extent that it departs from them, that's a mark against it. That's the bit that I think Aaronson is basically right about. But, and this is where I think the advocates of IIT have a point in response to him, agreement with these intuitions is not sacrosanct. And in principle, that's an important point, in principle, we should allow for the possibility that a theory of consciousness might have implications that are at odds with our intuitions about the distribution of consciousness, and perhaps radically so. But, this is a pro-Aaronson point, the more that a theory of consciousness departs from our intuitive views about the distribution of consciousness, the better the case for it must be. In the case of Russell's paradox, of course, that constraint was met because our attachment to the principle of non-contradiction, which is all that his argument was really relying on, is stronger than our intuition to the claim that for every well-defined property, there's a set of all and only the objects that have that property. Applied to IIT, the point is that because IIT's implications are extremely counterintuitive, the axiomatic argument for it needs to be very, very strong indeed. Okay, so how strong is the axiomatic argument? Not very strong, it seems to me. There are problems here both with the axiomatic method itself and with a particular way in which IIT deploys the method. I'm going to begin with the particularity, then I'll move on with some comments about problems facing the axiomatic method per se. So let's look at IIT's use of the axiomatic method. Although questions can be raised about every step of the axiomatic approach as IIT applies it, as I said before, I'm going to focus on the very first step, the identification of what the advocates of IIT called phenomenological axioms. Now, an axiom, as the term is used here, is a thesis about the subjective nature of consciousness that is self-evidently essential to consciousness. That's an important point. Axioms they're not merely guiding hypotheses that might be jettisoned at a later date should they turn out to be warranted. They are instead bedrock principles. And here's a quote from an IIT review paper. Axioms are self-evident truths about consciousness, the only truths that, with Descartes, cannot be doubted and do not need proof. So the idea seems to be that if a thesis is a genuine axiom, then its truth must be evident to any conscious creature who's able to understand it and has subjected it to serious reflection. The mere fact that there might be individuals, reasonable individuals, who, having reflected on a thesis, fail to find it intuitively compelling, arguably makes it the case that it isn't axiomatic. After all, any number of claims about consciousness might strike someone or other as self-evidently true. What matters is whether the truth of the relevant thesis is universally or at least extremely widely regarded as self-evidently essential to consciousness. So with that worry in mind, with that point in mind, let's look at some of the potential axioms or the putative axioms that the advocates of IIT have appealed to. There are 5 examples of phenomenological axioms that one can find in the IIT literature. I'll state these 5 axioms and we'll then follow with a brief gloss based on what the advocates of IIT themselves have said about its content. So here's the first axiom. It's called the axiom of intrinsic existence. Here's the gloss. Consciousness exists. My experience just is. Indeed, that my experience here and now exists, it's real or actual, is the only fact that I'm immediately and absolutely sure of. Moreover, my experience exists from its own intrinsic perspective, independent of external observers. Axiom 2, the axiom of composition. Experience is structured, being composed of several fundamental distinctions that exist within it. For example, within an experience, I may distinguish a piano, a blue color, a book, countless spatial locations, and so on. The third axiom is the axiom of information. Here's the gloss. Consciousness is specific. Each experience is the particular way it is composed of a specific set of phenomenal distinctions, thereby differing from any other possible experience. It's differentiated. Here's the fourth axiom, the axiom of integration. Experience is unitary, meaning that it's composed of a set of phenomenal distinctions bound together in various ways that are irreducible to non-interdependent subsets. And the fifth axiom is the axiom of exclusion. Here's the gloss. Consciousness is definite, content, and spatio-temporal grain. Each experience has the set of phenomenal distinctions it has, neither less, a subset, nor more, a superset. And it flows at the speed it flows, neither faster nor slower. Thus, the experience I am having is of seeing a body on a bed in a bedroom, a bookcase with books, one of which is a blue book, but I'm not having an experience with less content, say one lacking the phenomenal distinction blue or not blue, colored, not colored. So there's the 5 axioms that IIT appeals to, and a brief gloss provided by the advocates of IIT for each axiom. Now, I think there are 2 kinds of questions raised by these 5 axioms. The first is an interpretive one. What exactly does each axiom mean? Second question concerns the plausibility of each axiom. However the axiom is to be understood, what reason do we have for thinking that it's true, for thinking that it captures self-evidently an essential feature of consciousness? These 2 questions are obviously distinct, but they're also related. For in asking how an axiom ought to be interpreted, we might also want to consider which interpretation is the most plausible. Let's begin with the question of interpretation. The basic problem here is that the language in which these axioms is couched doesn't have the kind of precision that one finds in other axiomatic systems, such as maths and logic. For example, the axioms of IIT refer to such properties as composition, information, integration, and the like, but these terms themselves are not provided with clean definitions within the IoT literature, and they're understood in different ways by different theorists. Of course, definitions must come to an end at some point, but bringing them to an end just here seems to me to be a bit premature. Now, it would be a long and rather thankless task to go through each of these axioms, asking how it could or should be understood. I've done that in a previous paper called On the Axiomatic Foundations of the Integrated Information Theory of Consciousness, and I'm not going to duplicate that work here. Instead, what I want to do is focus on one particular axiom, the axiom of integration, and use it to illustrate some of the general problems that face any attempt to interpret the axioms of IIT. So, here's the axiom of integration again. Experience is unitary, meaning that it is composed of a set of phenomenal distinctions bound together in various ways that is irreducible to non-interdependent subsets. Now, obviously, we need to ask, what is it for experience to be unitary, and what is it for consciousness experience to be irreducible to non-interdependent subsets? The architects of IoT don't really tell us, but they do provide us with examples of the kind of unity in which they're interested here. They refer to the experience of a whole visual scene and say that it cannot be subdivided into independent experiences of the left and right sides of the visual field. They talk about an experience of the word sono, S-O-N-O, written in the middle of a blank page, as being irreducible to an experience of the word so on one's right and an experience of the word no on one's left. And they refer to the experience of seeing a red triangle as being irreducible to seeing a triangle and an experience of seeing redness. It's not just the conjunction of those two experiences, there's a sort of a holism implicit in the experience of seeing a red triangle. These examples suggest that the axiom of integration concerns what we might call, or what I have called in previous work, representational unity. Let's say, this is just a rough gloss, that two experiences E1 and E2 are representationally unified if and only if they occur as components of a complex experience whose contents can't be identified with the conjunction of the contents of each of the individual experiences E1 and E2. For example, the experience of a word as a token of sono cannot be identified with a conjunction of an experience of so and an experience of no, for it's coherent to suppose that one could have experiences of the word so and of the word no without representing the whole stimulus as the word sono. As a single state, the experience sono has a kind of emergent content that cannot simply be equated or identified with the conjunction of the contents of two words, so and no, respectively. So we have a slightly better idea of what might be meant by unity here, but we don't yet know what the axiom of integration asserts. Because in order to provide us with a putative phenomenological axiom, representational unity must figure in a truthfully valuable thesis. We need not just a concept of unity, a conception of what it is for experiences to be unified. We need a thesis that claims, that says something about how that conception of unity applies to consciousness. The following is an example of what such a thesis might look like. Let's call it integration 1. Necessarily, any two experiences that are had by the same subjective experience at the same time are representationally unified with each other. Now, is integration 1 axiomatic? Well, that seems unlikely. Although representational unity is indeed a common feature of consciousness, there are pathologies of consciousness in which it seems to break down. For example, in associative agnosia, patients appear to experience the individual features and parts of objects, but lack the ability to synthesize those features and parts into an integrated percept. There are perhaps also counterexamples to integration 1 in ordinary experience. For example, one can hear birdsong and feel a dull pain in one's calves without those two experiences being representationally unified with each other. Certainly, they needn't be representationally unified in the way in which the experience of seeing an object as red and circular are integrated, or as triangular are integrated with each other. Nor is there anything particularly unusual about these experiences. Many of the experiences that co-occur within one stream of consciousness are not representationally unified with each other. And even if the contents of human experience were always mutually representationally unified, It's not clear that there's any reason to think that this kind of unity captures an essential feature of consciousness. But perhaps the axiom of integration shouldn't really be understood in terms of representational unity. Perhaps it should be understood in terms of some other conception of experiential unity. Well, let's consider what the philosopher Barry Dehaene has called Gestalt unity. Two experiences are Gestalt unified when they require each other's presence, even though there are no entailment relations between their contents. Thus, an experience of birdsong might be Gestalt unified with a pain experience, if and only if it's the case that the existence of the pain demands the existence of the birdsong and vice versa, even though the content of neither experience entails or requires the content of the other. Gestalt unity suggests the following version of the axiom of integration, an alternative to integration 1, let's call it integration 2. Every phenomenal content or distinction that occurs within the subject's overall conscious state is Gestalt unified with every other phenomenal content or distinction that occurs within it. Now, perhaps integration 2 does a better job of capturing the intuitive idea behind the axiom of integration than integration 1 does, but it too, it seems to me, is implausible. The problem with integration 2 is that it makes the relations between any two unified experiences necessary, and that in turn entails that no two individuals could share any kind of experience, any kind of phenomenal content, unless they share all of their experiences. That claim, it seems to me, is not only prima facie implausible, it's also robustly at odds with the practice of consciousness science. Researchers studying, for example, shape perception invariably assume that two subjects can experience the same shape, even if they are, for example, in very different mood states. So it seems to me Gestalt unity is really, at best, a rare phenomenon. It's not essential to human experience, and it's certainly not essential to any possible form of experience. A third interpretation of the axiom of integration focuses on what we might call, speaking loosely, part-whole relations within particular experience. Distinguish two views of the structure of consciousness, an atomistic view on the one hand and a holistic view on the other. According to the phenomenal atomist, complex experiences, such as the one that perhaps captures what it's like to be you right now, are constructed from sets of simpler experiences. To take a very crude example, your current experience might be built up out of, say, a visual experience of what you're currently seeing, an experience of your body as occupying a certain position in space, certain location in space, and a background phenomenology of your bodily mood, of your background mood. Atomists might be tempted to treat these experiences, or at least something akin to them, as the building blocks of complex experiences. They get put together in various ways to create an overall complex experience that captures what it's like to be you right now. On this view, your overall phenomenology is generated by gluing these building blocks of experience together in various ways, perhaps by means of relations that are sometimes known as relations of co-consciousness. Holists, by contrast, regard your overall conscious experiential state as the basic unit of experience. On this view, although there is phenomenal differentiation within one's overall experience, one can distinguish visual experiences from an experience of one's body, from bodily experience, and both of those from mood experience. This differentiation doesn't really demarcate independent units of consciousness, and thus there's no need for any kind of glue that might bind independent experiences together to form an overall complex experience. And you might think that what the advocates of IIT have in common in appealing to the axiom of integration is an endorsement of some kind of phenomenal holism. Whether or not phenomenal holism does capture what the architects of IIT have in mind, it certainly represents a possible interpretation of the claim that consciousness is, quote, irreducible to non-interdependent subsets of experience. So in light of this, we might consider a third interpretation of the axiom of integration, call it integration 3. No experience can be built up out of simpler experiences. Is this claim plausibly regarded as a phenomenological axiom? Well, I'm inclined to think that it's true that no experience can be built up out of simpler experiences. I am very much attracted to phenomenal holism. But I very much doubt that integration 3 qualifies as a phenomenological axiom in the sense required here. And there are two reasons, or a couple of reasons for this. First, the contrast between phenomenal holism and phenomenal atomism isn't, I think, manifest from a subjective point of view. It's not the kind of thing that one has introspective access to. Why? Because one doesn't have first-person access to the underlying causal structure of consciousness. Both the atomist and the holist can allow that ordinary human experience includes a number of phenomenal distinctions that are bound together in various ways. It's just that they give different explanations for this fact. The atomist regards at least some of these distinctions as involving distinct experiences that are bound together by a genuine relation. The holist regards these distinctions as merely differences in content, and the binding relation is merely a nominal relation and not a real causally efficacious relation. The second reason is that even if phenomenal holism is true of us, it's not clear that we've got any reason to think that it captures an essential feature of consciousness. So the structure of human consciousness might be, as it were, holistic, but other kinds of creatures, consciousness as it is occurs in other kinds of creatures, might have an atomistic structure. So I don't think it's, as it were, axiomatic in either the sense of being self-evident from an introspective point of view, nor does it plausibly capture an essential feature of consciousness. Let's take stock. I've looked at three interpretations of one particular axiom that is appealed to by the advocates of IoT, the axiom of integration. And I've argued that none of these interpretations does the axiom plausibly capture a feature of consciousness that seems, from the first person point of view, to be essential to consciousness. And that in turn suggests that the so-called axiom of integration isn't really axiomatic. For something's axiomatic or phenomenologically axiomatic only if it strikes those who have reflected on the matter to capture a feature of consciousness that's revealed to be essential to it from a third person point of view. Now, there are, of course, various ways in which the advocate of the axiomatic approach might push back against this line of criticism. For example, it might be argued that there's another interpretation of the axiom of integration that I've not considered, which would strike most people as capturing an essential feature of consciousness. Now, I don't have any proof that there's no such interpretation, but for what it's worth, I'm skeptical. More generally, of course, the advocate of the axiomatic approach might distance themselves from this particular axiom, and indeed from all of the axioms associated with IIT, and invoke an entirely different set of axioms in order to motivate their preferred theory of consciousness. So this proposal, of course, requires that we now consider the merits of the axiomatic approach itself and abstract away from the particular axioms that IIT appeals to. And here I think we need to recognize that there are good reasons to think that the axiomatic method is not well suited to the study of consciousness. One problem is the very general fact that the axiomatic methods are most closely associated with mathematics and logic. It's exceedingly rare, I think, to find them employed in the mechanical or life sciences. And thus, to the extent that one is or ought to be attracted to the idea that the study of consciousness has its natural home in neuroscience or psychology, evolutionary theory perhaps, then one ought to be skeptical of the axiomatic approach. A second point seems to me that we ought to be skeptical that there really are any phenomenological axioms in the sense required by the axiomatic approach. Or, more carefully, it's not clear to me that what phenomenological axioms there are sufficiently rich to ground a theory of consciousness. Arguably, the only feature of consciousness that's both essential to it and available from the first person point of view is the fact that there's something it's like to be in a conscious state. And it seems to me that that claim is simply not rich enough to justify or ground a comprehensive theory of consciousness. Consciousness may, of course, have other features that are essential to it, but it's not at all clear that first-person acquaintance with consciousness has the capacity to reveal those features. Certainly doesn't have those capacity to reveal those features as being essential to consciousness. After all, the only form of consciousness to which we have direct access is our own. We don't have direct access to all forms of human consciousness, let alone the kind of consciousness that characterizes non-human species or machines. We can, of course, make inferences about the features of other forms of consciousness based on the features of our own consciousness, but there's no reason to assume that those inferences will be especially privileged, will be privileged in the way that the axiomatic method seems to require. So the upshot of all this, it seems to me, is that the axiomatic method, this top-down approach to developing or grounding a theory of consciousness, isn't really viable. Let me turn now to what I regard as its most prominent competitor, what I'm going to call the correlational approach. Here's the idea at the heart of the correlational approach. We first develop a theory of consciousness that's adequate for humans, or perhaps adequate for neurotypical adult humans, and then extend that theory to other types of systems in order to determine whether or not they're conscious. Now, the most prominent example of the correlational approach is provided by the global workspace theory of consciousness. And so I'm going to develop my discussion of the correlational approach in dialogue with thinking about the global workspace theory and how it might be developed, it might be applied in connection with the correlational approach. According to the global workspace theory, representations become conscious when their contents are available to a wide range of cognitive processes, including those involved in attention, evaluation, memory, verbal report, and so on. This basic claim, which was first provided by the psychologist Bernie Bars, has been developed into a neural theory, sometimes called the neuronal global workspace theory, which provides an account of where and how the global workspace is implemented in the human brain. According to neuronal global workspace theory, sensory information gains access to the global workspace when it's broadcast within an anatomically widespread workspace, which is implemented across higher order cortical association areas with a particular, although not exclusive, emphasis on prefrontal cortex. Access to the global workspace is achieved through a nonlinear net recognition in which recurrent processing amplifies and sustains particular neural representations. So that's the basic idea. You've got consciousness involves access to a global workspace through a process of ignition, and the workspace is located in prefrontal, also parietal areas. What exactly is global workspace theory a theory of? Now, there are two parts to this question. The first is whether it's a theory of phenomenal consciousness, subjective experience, or whether it's just a theory of what Ned Block has called access consciousness. Although its proponents sometimes suggest that global workspace theory is really just a theory of access consciousness, or conscious access, as they sometimes put it, I'm going to assume here that it's a theory of phenomenal consciousness of subjective experience. That's at least how it's sometimes understood, in particular by those who regard global workspace theory as a competitor to other theories of phenomenal consciousness. And more importantly, it's how global workspace theory needs to be understood if it's going to address the problem that we're interested in here, which is, of course, a problem about the distribution of phenomenal consciousness. Here's the second part of the question: what exactly is global workspace theory a theory of? What's the scope of the theory? What range of entities does global workspace theory take itself to address? The possible answers to this question can be marked on a spectrum. At one end, the conservative end of the spectrum, is the idea that global workspace theory is really just a theory of human consciousness, that it doesn't purport or shouldn't be understood to give a theory of human consciousness in general. Of consciousness in general. It's really just a theory of human consciousness. At the more ambitious end of that spectrum, global workspace theory can, of course, be understood as a comprehensive theory of consciousness, one that applies to any possible conscious agent. And in between these 2 points on the spectrum are, of course, a range of positions. Now, although the advocates of global workspace theory haven't always been very clear on this point, my sense is that they tend to view it as a comprehensive theory of consciousness. At any rate, that's how I'm going to view it here. That's how it needs to be understood in order to provide us with guidance with respect to the problem of other minds. But now we face two challenges. The first is an interpretive one. In order to apply the global workspace theory to a system, for example, a non-human animal, an AI system, we have to know what exactly a global workspace is. What qualifies a workspace? What constraints does a workspace need to meet in order to qualify as genuinely global? Let's explore this challenge by considering infant consciousness, human infant consciousness. What would it mean to apply global workspace theory to infants? Well, one would look for evidence of ignition in global workspace in infants, particularly insofar as it relates to activation parietal and prefrontal areas. And there are various ways in which a relatively unequivocal answer to this question might have emerged. For example, it could have turned out, perhaps in some sense it could still turn out, that infants have nothing like ignition or nothing like a global workspace, and that the adult workspace emerges from what infants have, which is a completely decentralized architecture. Equally, perhaps it could have turned out, perhaps in some sense it could turn out, that infants have a workspace that very closely resembles ours in structure, in profile, in functioning. But it looks like that neither of those possibilities are likely. Instead, it looks like infants have something like a global workspace, albeit one that's hooked up to a very different range of consuming systems and which operates on a very, very different time scale. In fact, in the infant brain, everything related to consciousness seems to be distinctly slower. In other words, the workspace that we find in the infant brain resembles the global workspace of adult human cognition in certain respects, but not in others. And so the question is, well, does it qualify as a global workspace, a la the requirements of the global workspace theory, or not? This challenge, this question isn't restricted at all to human infants, but is also confronts us in contexts involving adults who have suffered from brain damage, non-human animals, and AI systems. Consider, for example, insects. Insects don't even have a cortex, so they couldn't clearly have a consuming system that's located in prefrontal parietal areas. And they lack all sorts of consuming systems that we have, those involved in reportability, mental time travel, and so on. So whatever kind of workspace an insect might have, it's clearly not going to be a global workspace in precisely the same ways that ours is. This point applies even more obviously to AI systems, which can differ along ours in terms of multiple dimensions when it comes to questions of cognitive architecture. But suppose that this interpretive question, that is the question of how to interpret the key constructs employed by the global workspace theory, can be answered, can be satisfactorily answered. We'd then still be faced by a second question, namely, why should we assume that because consciousness is correlated with global workspace activity in the human case, it's also correlated with global workspace activity in other kinds of systems? After all, isn't this essentially simply a one-shot inference? As we noted, that is, it's in some sense an inference from a single case, human beings. And as we noted in connection with the argument from analogy in a previous lecture, one-shot inferences, although they're not always unreasonable, they're often unreasonable. And I think it would be an open question whether they could be justified in this context. At the very least, the advocate of the correlational approach owes us an account of why we would be justified, why we are justified, if we are justified, in generalizing from the human case to other kinds of cognitive systems. Before I bring this lecture to a close, I want to briefly consider two other responses to the questions that we've just been considering. That is, two other ways of thinking about global workspace theory in connection with what I've been calling the correlational approach. The first of these responses can be found, it's at least gestured at, in a 2017 paper by Stan Dehaene, Sid Kouider, and Hak-Won Lau entitled, "What is Consciousness and Could Machines Have It?" The line that's suggested in this paper, although not, I think, explicitly endorsed, is rather surprising. Instead of treating the question of machine consciousness as a substantive question, the answer to which might, in principle, be beyond our ken, beyond our knowledge, the authors of this paper seem to treat it as an issue that's to be decided by stipulation. In looking at infants, non-human animals, and AI systems, they point out, we might be confronted by a range of cognitive workspaces, some of which will very nearly resemble our own, others which will be radically different from ours, and in the middle there'll be workspaces of intermediate degrees of similarity. On this view, the question of which of these workspaces we should treat as consciousness supporting isn't to be decided, isn't to be adjudicated by discovery, by experiment, but is to be answered really by matter of stipulation. We simply decide that some of these workspaces qualify as global in the relevant sense, others don't. I take this nominalist interpretation of the global workspace theory to run strongly counter to the realist tendencies that most of us have. Realist tendencies that are generally presupposed in the study of consciousness. The claim that human consciousness involves the operations of a global workspace is, I think, generally and rightly treated as a substantive proposal, and not merely a report about how we've decided to use the term consciousness or how we should use the term consciousness. But if we're realists about human consciousness, as I think we should be, then it's hard to see why we shouldn't also be realists about other forms of consciousness, infant consciousness, animal consciousness, artificial consciousness, and so on. In my view, advocates of the global workspace account should really be looking for a principal way to decide on what is to count as a genuine consciousness supporting global workspace, and shouldn't attempt to dodge or sidestep that challenge by stipulation or by decision. Perhaps a more interesting, or certainly more philosophically worked through response to this challenge is provided by Peter Carruthers in a number of places, including his recent book, Human and Animal Minds, The Consciousness Questions Laid to Rest. Abstracting away from a number of details, Carruthers argues that if the global workspace theory is correct, and if it provides a fully reductive account of consciousness, then questions about consciousness in systems with a different cognitive architecture, that is, most, if not all, non-human animals, don't really have a substantive answer. In other words, Carruthers argues that the global workspace account entails that there's simply no fact of the matter as to whether non-human animals are conscious. And, crucially, Carruthers also argues that the global workspace theory does provide a plausible and fully reductive theory of human consciousness. Now, I'm not going to provide a full detailed treatment of Carruthers' position here, but I do, in closing, want to briefly comment on a couple of issues that his position raises. First, to comment on the claim that the global workspace theory provides a theory of consciousness that's both true, or at least plausibly true, and fully reductive. Now, I'm not myself convinced that global workspace theory is true, let alone fully reductive. As I see it, there are really two problems here. First, most and perhaps all of the methods that we currently have for studying consciousness really assume that the contents of consciousness will be globally available for the control of thought and action, or at least close to globally available. And if that's right, then it's not clear that any conscious states that aren't globally available for the control of thought and action would be identified as conscious states. If they were to exist, that is, if the global workspace theory were false, I'm not sure that we would know about it. Our current methods for gathering evidence about consciousness wouldn't permit us to alight on them. So there's a deep methodological challenge here, it seems to me, when it comes to evaluating the global workspace theory. Second, I don't think there's any reason to treat the global workspace theory as a reductive theory of consciousness. That is, as a theory that would close the explanatory gap between neurofunctional states on the one hand, physical and functional states, and phenomenal or experiential states on the other. In order to close the explanatory gap, it seems to me, a theory must make it incoherent to suppose that the neurofunctional states it appeals to obtain, but there are no corresponding phenomenal states. But it seems to me that there's no reason to think of the global workspace theory in those terms, for it seems entirely coherent to suppose that a creature might possess a global workspace as per the demands of the global workspace theory, and yet not be phenomenally conscious. Note that I'm not presenting that thought as an objection to the global workspace theory, but I'm merely presenting it as a reason to deny that the theory, even if true, qualifies as a fully reductive, that is, an explanatory gap closing account of consciousness. So There, briefly, are some reservations about the claim that global workspace theory is both true and fully reductive of human consciousness. But it's really the conditional claim, the claim that if global workspace theory was true and fully reductive, then there'd be no fact of the matter as to whether non-human animals, for example, are phenomenally conscious that's most striking. It's also the component of Carruthers' position that's most relevant to our present concerns. For if it's true, then the problem of other minds is dealt with really in one fell swoop, as it were. No longer do we need to concern ourselves with the messy business of trying to figure out which non-human creatures are conscious or what conscious states they're in. Instead, we can pretty much ignore the problem of other conscious minds, safe in the knowledge that we alone are conscious. But it seems to me unlikely that Carruthers' conditional, as I'll call it, is true. Let me begin by pointing out, fairly obviously, that it's strongly counterintuitive. It runs very robustly against received opinion, and as such, we need a really good argument in order to be justified in adopting it. What is Carruthers' argument? Well, there's some complicated parts to it, but reduced to its essentials, I think his argument goes something like this. When a certain representational content enters the global workspace, we're able to represent it in a distinctive kind of way. We're able to think of it, that content that is, from the inside. This way of representing a state, a content, involves what philosophers call phenomenal concepts, concepts of experience that represent experiences in terms of what it's like to have them or what it's like to be in the corresponding experiential state. But because phenomenal concepts are inferentially isolated from physical and functional concepts, they end up generating the famous explanatory gap that we were just talking about. And they seem to encourage the view that we are aware of states, qualia, as we might call them, that can't be integrated into our ordinary scientific understanding of the world. They seem to encourage a certain kind of dualism. But then once we've got that view in mind, we're naturally led to wonder about the distribution of these properties, qualia, as it were, in other kinds of systems, such as non-human animals. But from the point of view of the global workspace theory, as Carruthers understands its implications, all of this is an illusion, for there are no qualia, there are no, as it were, non-physical, non-functional states. Instead, there are only ordinary representational states that become objects of a distinctive kind of representation when they enter a global workspace. Now, there's a great deal to consider in that argument, and what my presentation of it really is somewhat compressed. To do justice to Carruthers, I would encourage you to look at his papers, and in particular his recent book. But that said, I want to make 2 points by way of pushing back against the position. The first is this. It seems to me that if Carruthers' conditional is right, then it threatens to have quite radical implications, not just for questions of consciousness in non-human animals and AI systems, but also for the kinds of questions that we've already looked like, questions involving our fellow human beings. As I've already noted, the kind of workspace seen in human infants looks as though it might differ in important respects from that seen in neurotypical adult humans. The workspace that we find in neurotypical adult human beings looks like it might differ from the workspace seen in human beings who have suffered from severe brain injury. And indeed, it's not clear to me that we really know how much variation there might be between neurotypical adult human beings with respect to the structure and dynamics of global workspace activity. In other words, the assumption that we can refer to the kind of workspace that is distinctive of human consciousness might itself be rather problematic. So the, as it were, implications, the radical implications of Carruthers' position that he's happy to accept when it comes to non-human animals might also be naturally extended, might also, the argument, if it's good, might also apply to humans who have suffered from severe brain damage, human infants, and perhaps the other cases involving human beings. Second point speaks more directly to the argument that Carruthers gives for the crucial conditional. Assume that he's right to take the possibility of phenomenal concepts as being essential to the possession of phenomenal consciousness. I myself don't have much sympathy for that claim, but I'm willing to grant it for the sake of argument. Here's the crucial question. Why would it follow, as Carruthers' argument seems to require, that only systems which share our cognitive architecture could have phenomenal states. Surely other kinds of workspaces could also support the possession and deployment of phenomenal concepts. As far as I can see, the conditional that Carruthers appeals to is one that really restricts phenomenal concepts, or the possession and deployment of phenomenal concepts, to certain kinds of workspaces. But those workspaces need not have precisely the same architecture as our workspace. So the conditional, given his starting point, the conditional that he really ends up with, I think, would seem to allow, at least in principle, would seem to allow various types of non-human animals into the consciousness club. I'll end my brief engagement with Carruthers' position here, but I'm going to conclude with a quick recap of the main points in this lecture. I began with the fairly obvious point that we might be able to make progress with the scientific problem of other minds if we had a comprehensive theory of consciousness. The problem, of course, is that it looks as though we need to first make progress with the scientific problem of other minds in order to develop that comprehensive theory. In effect, we need to find some way of addressing what I've called the circularity challenge. I then considered two possible approaches to this challenge: the axiomatic approach and the correlational approach. The axiomatic approach is most closely associated with IRT and involves justifying a theory of consciousness on the basis of appeals to phenomenological axioms, claims about the nature of consciousness that are allegedly self-evident. The correlational approach isn't applied to any one theory of consciousness, but in presenting it, I focused on the global workspace theory because it's an account of consciousness that enables us to see most clearly the challenges facing the correlational approach. Does this mean that the theory-based approaches to the scientific problem of other minds should be rejected, or worse, that the scientific problem can't be solved? Neither response, it seems to me, would be appropriate, but there's an alternative to both the axiomatic and correlational approaches, which we haven't yet talked about: the natural kind approach. In the next lecture, I'll explain what the natural kind approach involves, and I'll argue that it represents a viable response to the scientific problem of other minds.